So, Eddie Jones has already had one World Cup cycle with this England team, with him initially being hired after the 2015 Rugby World Cup and starting his tenure as England's main man in charge during the 2016 Six Nations, which he won in England's first Grand Slam since 2003, selecting what people saw at the time as a new exciting group of players building on the actually underrated base built up by Stuart Lancaster, despite how that World Cup turned out, with some of the older players in the squad playing with a point to prove and Dylan Hartley being chosen as Eddie Jones' first captain, as well as new young talented players like Maro Itoje, Carl Sinclair, Jack Clifford, Ellis Genge, Paul Hill and Elliot Daly all making their England debuts under Eddie Jones in his first year in charge. In a year which he had a 3-0 whitewash win in a test series with the Wallabies, followed by him capping off an incredible run with 4 convincing victories against the Springboks, Fiji, Argentina and the Wallabies again in the autumn internationals that year. This form continued into his next year in charge, with England winning the Six Nations but not getting the Grand Slam, losing to Ireland away, and with 2017 being a Lions Tour year, he experimented with his squad, giving debuts to players like Tom Curry, Denny Solomona and Nick Ezekwe, bringing a very youthful squad over with him to Argentina, where they won both tests they played over there. Then the autumn came around and it was more experimentation with his squad, players like Nathan Hughes, Samisa Rokodunguni, Alex Lozovsky, Henry Slade, Piers Francis and Sam Simmons being major parts of that autumn and the summer internationals. And then we hit 2018. And the Eddie Jones era faced its first real period where things weren't quite going to plan. It's been well documented that this year was a year where Eddie Jones tried to push his players the hardest he'd ever pushed anyone. Brutal training sessions, bringing in the Georgian pack as a sparring partner, which by all accounts just turned very quickly into a bit of a war, and results suffered, with that year's Six Nations starting okay with home victories against Wales and a convincing away win against the Italians, but after that it felt like the team had reached its limit, with very convincing losses to France and Scotland away, and then again against the Grand Slam champions that year, Ireland, at home. Now, the point of me bringing up all this history in a video called England's Fly-Half Dilemma is because through all of it, the ups and downs, the two fly-halves that Eddie Jones has deployed have been Leicester Tigers' George Ford and Saracens' Owen Farrell, who through his versatility and size has been able to slot in at 12 to accommodate the two players starting in the team. George Ford being one of the best front foot attacking fly-halves in the Northern Hemisphere, and Owen Farrell being one of the most consistent and successful game managers in the world, as well as having an underrated attacking game as well. And these two have basically been involved in every single game Eddie Jones has been in charge of since his appointment, with Owen Farrell starting every single one that he was available for, being deployed mostly at 12 with one game where he started at 10 up until that 2018 season. But even then Ford was on the bench for that one, and actually came on after 10 minutes because the game wasn't going well against Australia. They were the two main pieces and on-field decision makers for Eddie Jones' England side up until this point, whilst also being childhood friends, which I reckon helped with them sharing leadership duties as well as being two fly-halves collaborated on the field who are used to it always being their show. We also know now that they were the two main locker room leaders in the team, driving standards at training and being some of the main talkers in the group, which in sport means that if you're one of the main players, you get most of the credit when things go well, but you also get most of the blame when things don't. It's just the way it is. And this downturn in form of England coincided with Danny Cipriani having one of the best Premiership seasons ever for Wasps, taking his usually outstanding play to even higher levels, with both George Ford's club form and international performances being questioned in the media. And with England's 2 back-to-back losses in their Test Series tour against South Africa that year, despite George Ford actually playing quite well in spurts during those games, Danny Cipriani was brought in to start that final test. Owen Farrell being basically the unofficial captain for the last year meant that if there was going to be any sort of changes in the fly-half and decision-making roles, it would probably be George Ford who would have to make way. Cipriani played well and made the match-winning play for England to win, and it seemed to be the changing of the guard for the England team, with Cipriani being a slightly more flary version of George Ford, who Eddie Jones could see as an option to cover 15 as well, as he brought him on at fullback in the pre-tour loss against the Barbarians, with Cipriani getting a lovely assist to Johnny May. And in my opinion, he was undeniably the better option for the team going forward, as if I wanted a defensively suspect attacking fly-half option to accompany Owen Farrell, of the two I'd pick Cipriani over Ford. And if not for an off-field incident with Danny Cipriani before the 2018-19 season began, I think he would have been at the bare minimum the second fly-half option for England at the 2019 World Cup. But what happened, happened. And England went back to the tried and trusted formula of Farrell and Ford being a combo, but with a bit more of Farrell starting games at fly-half and Ford being a player coming off the bench, with meaty midfielders Ben Teo and Tuolangi being brought into the centres. During the following Autumn and Six Nations, England seemed to get their groove back, with George Ford actually having a really impressive Premiership campaign with Leicester Tigers, which he continued going into the World Cup with a really splendid campaign, getting England to the final, something that England hadn't done as a country since our very jammy team of 2007. And since that World Cup final, England and Eddie Jones have basically followed the same pattern as the previous World Cup cycle, with it this time coming about 6 months earlier. An impressive first year and a half sticking with Ford and Farrell as our main guys. Then after that, a poor by expectations Six Nations campaign with players looking like they have had their last campaign in an England team. The time for an injection of new talent into a starting team is now. But unlike the last time this has happened, it's a little more complicated. The first point and most obvious is the pressing matter of one Marcus Smith, who is similarly to Danny Cipriani in 2018 put together a truly incredible run of form and success in the last 2 seasons, with his pace, footwork and overall game management reaching new heights to a point where he's just undeniable at this point. I'm a sucker for a young English prospect, but I mean this when I say this. He's glorious, and he's good enough to be England's main man, guiding his Harlequins team to a Premiership title in magnificently flary, goose-stepping style. And Eddie Jones brought him into his summer test squad straight after that achievement, where he barely put a foot wrong against both Canada and the USA, and he capped off an amazing season with a late call-up to the Lions tour where he handled himself beautifully, and really showed he belonged in the company of the amazing players on that tour, with analysts like Ronan O'Gara, who is low-key the best TV pundit in the Northern Hemisphere, saying he looks like the starting 10 for the next Lions series, and not gonna lie, my heart soared when he said that. But bias aside, he's shown that he's minimum top 2 fly halves in the Premiership in my opinion. Now, second point of complication is the Owen Farrell factor. Now, 2024 England Rugby and Owen Farrell has been a very interesting and unprecedented time. Obviously, we have the pandemic affecting the flow of the season, but you also have the relegation of Saracens for breaches of the salary cap, which meant that some of England's best and most well-known players spent a year playing in the Championship. One of those players, of course, being England captain Owen Farrell, whose 2020 started off pretty well despite an opening day loss in the Six Nations against France, as England ended up winning the tournament and then winning the Autumn Nations Amazon Cup thing on top of that. During that time, people were critiquing England's approach to the game, as England were a little dull to watch, to put it gently. But when you get in results, people don't seem to care. But when next year's Six Nations came around, England struggled to get the job done, losing against Scotland, Wales, and getting well and truly spanked by Ireland in the last game. Inevitably, questions were being asked. There was a lot of debate about whether the Saracens boys' inclusion in the squad was a good idea, considering none of them had played any top-flight rugby before the Six Nations. But Eddie stuck to his guns, and I think, to be honest, it was the right call on most of the players, including Owen Farrell. But this downturn in form unfortunately has seen people start to question his role in the England team, with people questioning his inclusion on the Lions tour squad that year, and his subsequent performances on that tour being questioned as well. Now, I think after this year, it's fair to question Owen Farrell's form, and as a result, with the amount of options for players in England, those questions need to be asked. But this has been a very disruptive season for all the Saracens players. But now with them coming back into the Premiership, we will be able to get a better gauge of whether Owen Farrell is still that guy. Also, we still are yet to see him have a consistent run at fly half for us. In my opinion, I think England need to move on from him being at 12. I think it only works when Manu Tuolangi is fit, and I just don't think England can rely on that as much anymore. It's too inconsistent, which I feel sad saying because he's one of my favourite players, but I think with the player pool that Eddie Jones has at his disposal and all these young exciting talents coming through, I think you need to give the likes of Ollie Lawrence and maybe even Max Ojimo a chance in that 12 jersey and see what we can do with these kind of players, especially with these new laws coming in and encouraging quick play. I think having Farrell exclusively at 10 in a shootout with whoever his competition is would give both the team and him clarity in their role, allowing him to use his underrated attacking skills whilst also giving us more options out wider in the backs, if you're going to pick him. We also have to factor in that he is England's captain, and having a captain whose place in the team is being questioned can be disruptive to team chemistry. But as we have seen with Eddie, he seems to be able to handle this transition quite well. Whether that's luck or by design, I guess we will see. And the final factor of complication is our two other talented fly halves in England, the most obvious being George Ford and the other, in my opinion, being Joe Simmons. Now, there's obviously players like Jacob Umanga who are outstanding in the Premiership and recently made his debut in the summer, but I think there's only two players who are at the level right now to challenge the other main two, being Farrell and Smith. Well, who he'll actually pick. I miss you, Danny. Anyway, obviously we have George Ford, who a cheeky man on the internet said is the best 10 in the world, and Joe Simmons. Now, I think for all he's accomplished in his young career, Joe Simmons is very underrated in my opinion. If we take all of his team accomplishments with Exeter out of it and just look at his overall play, he's kind of like an international coach's dream. He very rarely, if ever, makes a mistake and is skillful and flary enough to make things happen on his own at times. It's a shame that he probably just won't get a shot at the international level simply because, in my opinion, everything that he's good at, Owen Farrell is as well, and Farrell can play 12 as well. So I believe Farrell is always going to win that selection duel, despite him captaining his team to both European and Premiership titles at the age of 24. Now, as I'm writing this, England have announced a training camp squad of 45 with some notable absentees and inclusions, and I believe these selections support my theory about Eddie Jones deciding that now is the time to evolve the squad, with no Vunipola brothers, no Elliot Daly, and most notably, no George Ford, with Marcus Smith being preferred as the second fly-off in the squad. Now, whether this will continue into the autumn internationals, only time will tell. But despite me believing that George Ford is one of the best front foot attackers in world rugby, with incredible pace and decision-making skills, I do think this is the right call long term. The time for Smith is now, and I can't wait to see how it shakes up. Also, if we get a Cipriani renaissance, I won't be mad either. Quay Cooper's back. It's 2011, baby. Let's go. Get on board. Anyway, that's my thoughts on the situation. I hope you enjoyed. Signed, NGJ.